In the heart of the Ypsilon sector, where stars blazed against the infinite blackness of space, a singular planet spun at the axis of countless galaxies. That planet name was Kyria. Kyria, it was more than a planet, it was the nucleus of intergalactic power, the beating heart of a sprawling civilization that spanned 1,000 star systems. Kyria was home to the Intergalactic Alliance, the ruling body of this galaxy and the central hub where politics, culture, and military might converged. Above all, it was the cradle of knowledge. At the core of Kyria's vibrant metropolis lay the Interstellar Academy, a massive and sprawling institution, its gleaming towers piercing the purple-streaked sky. From these towers flowed the knowledge that would shape the galaxy's future leaders. It was here that the galaxy's most prestigious races, nobles, bigots, and hopeful minds, sent their young. Not for the sake of wealth or fame, but to forge the future of their species. Professor Grok, a towering figure known throughout the galaxy for his storied military career, was now one of the Academy's most respected instructors. His broad shoulders bore the scars of interstellar warfare, and his emerald eyes gleamed with the wisdom of countless battles. He had served as an admiral in the Alliance's flotilla, having commanded a fleet that once held the entire eastern arm of the galaxy. Now, he channeled that experience into teaching, specifically, the social sciences of war, diplomacy, and leadership. The lecture hall was vast, its amphitheater-style seating filled with cadets from dozens of races. The air buzzed with the hum of youthful energy, each student a representative of their homeworld, eager to prove their worth. Despite the diversity in appearances, from the shimmering silver-skinned Elvorians to the sleek, amphibious Lagwan, each cadet wore the same uniform, the emblem of the Academy stitched proudly on their chests. Grok, standing before them, regarded the room with quiet authority. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble that seemed to resonate through the walls themselves. What is the most intimidating race in the galaxy? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Immediately, a hand shot up. It was Ares, a cadet from the Lagwan species. The Lagwa were known for their brilliance in tactical strategy, their homeworld covered in water, with entire cities submerged beneath the oceans. Ares had been bred for leadership since birth. Without a moment's hesitation, he answered, "The Krokans, Professor. They are indomitable, with their strong bodies it is almost impossible to die in battle. And in warfare, they are feared for good reason. Their armies have crushed resistance in every major conflict." A murmur of agreement swept through the room. The Krokans were indeed a terrifying race, towering beings of muscle and bone, with skin like stone and minds honed for combat. In the annals of war, few could match their brutality or their conquests. But Professor Grok shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "The most intimidating race in the galaxy is the Terrans." There was a moment of stunned silence. The cadets exchanged incredulous glances, and then laughter erupted from a few of the back rows. Terrans? Those fragile, unimpressive creatures from a backward world called Earth? The idea seemed preposterous. One cadet stood abruptly, his silvery robes rippling with disdain. It was Arima, of the noble Elvorian bloodline. The Elvorians were one of the most ancient races, their long lives and advanced intellects allowing them to rise to prominence in nearly every facet of galactic society. Arima's violet eyes gleamed with certainty as he addressed Grok. "Terrans," he said, incredulity coloring every syllable. "With all due respect, Professor, Terrans are weak. They have no real standing in the galaxy. Their technology lags behind, their homeworld is nothing special, and their bodies, well, they're among the most fragile in the galaxy." "Surely, you jest." Grok smiled. It was the kind of smile that only came from a man who had seen far more than the cadets in front of him could even imagine. "Arima, on the surface, you are correct," Grok began, pacing in front of the class. "The Terrans are physically weaker than most species. Their technology isn't cutting edge, and they have no extraordinary abilities like the Varnaki, who can shift through dimensions, or the Zealans, who command telepathic communication across solar systems. But what they do have," Grok paused for effect, "is something far more valuable. Adaptability." He gestured toward the enormous holoscreen behind him, which flickered to life, showing a sprawling planetary system. Consider this: nearly every species in this galaxy is adapted to a specific environment. Some thrive only in darkness, others in extreme heat or cold, some beneath the sea. But the Terrans? They can live anywhere. Desert, tundra, ocean, even space itself. They adapt quickly, and not just to their environments, but to their enemies. Grok's tone grew more intense, drawing the attention of every cadet. He was no longer just teaching. He was imparting a hard-learned lesson from the battlefield. 200 years ago, the Zegars, one of the most technologically advanced races, entered into a conflict with the Terrans. The Zegars were certain of their victory. Their planetary defense grid was considered impenetrable. Their ships were faster, their weapons stronger. And yet, the Terrans won. The room was deathly silent now. No one interrupted. No one even shifted in their seat. Grok had their full attention. How? Ares asked, his voice barely a whisper. Grok smiled grimly. The Terrans did what no one expected. Instead of meeting the Zegars in open battle, they analyzed the situation, adapted to the circumstances, and exploited the one weakness the Zegars didn't even know they had. The Terrans infiltrated the Zegar homeworld with a handful of ships, bypassed the defense grid through a combination of ingenuity and sheer audacity, and captured their entire ruling class in a single night. The holoscreen flashed to images of small, worn Terran ships navigating the Zegar defense network, landing deep within the capital. Images of Zegar nobility being marched from their palatial estates under the watchful eyes of Terran soldiers filled the screen. They did not need to fight the Zegar armies head-on. Grok said, his voice a low growl. They crippled them from the inside. That is the essence of Terran warfare. They are survivors, problem solvers. They do not fight for honor, glory, or conquest. They fight to win, by any means necessary. Arima, still standing, looked troubled. But surely their weaknesses are their strengths, Grok interrupted. Their ingenuity, their creativity, their unpredictability. Give a Terran an old transport ship and a mining laser, and they'll turn it into a war machine. Their capacity for innovation is unrivaled, not because they have the best tools, but because they make the best of what they have. That, Arima, is why they are the most intimidating race in the galaxy. The professor let his words linger, watching as the cadets absorbed the truth. These students, from privileged backgrounds and powerful species, had been conditioned to believe that strength came from might or wealth. But Grok had learned long ago that true power came from something far less tangible. The galaxy is vast, Grok said, softer now. And in the end, it's not always the strongest or the most advanced who prevail. It's those who can adapt, who can see solutions where others see obstacles. Terrans embody that spirit more than any other race I've encountered. The bell chimed softly, signaling the end of the lecture. But none of the cadets moved. They remained seated, their minds turning over the professor's words, their perceptions of strength and weakness forever altered. As they began to rise and file out, Grok sat at his desk, observing them with a quiet satisfaction. The galaxy was changing, and soon, these students would be the ones leading it. They would face challenges far greater than they could imagine, battles not only of ships and soldiers, but of ideas and survival. Cadets started to leave the class one by one, and they could see how the towering halls of the Interstellar Academy buzzed with the kind of energy that only a change in the winds could bring. Since Professor Grok's last lecture, the students had been wrestling with a new, unsettling realization. The galaxy was vast, full of ancient, powerful species, but the frail, unassuming Terrans, humans from a distant, largely disregarded planet, were more formidable than anyone had thought. Grok's words had lingered, like the aftermath of a storm, whispering through the corridors and across lunch tables. And now, it seemed, the storm was about to break. It was early morning when the announcement came. The Academy's central communication system chimed across every classroom, dormitory, and hall. Holographic screens flickered to life, displaying the emblem of the Academy, a shimmering star surrounded by the symbols of the galaxy's most prominent races. The head of the Academy, Chancellor Zelara, appeared. She was an imposing figure, a Valran, whose cobalt blue skin and 6 glowing eyes gave her an ethereal presence. Her voice, though firm, carried a melody that echoed through the Academy's intercoms. Attention, students and faculty of the Interstellar Academy. I have a very special announcement. Starting next semester, the Academy will be honored to host a new professor, one with a background unlike any we have seen here before. A Terran, a member of the human race from Earth, will be joining our esteemed teaching staff. A ripple of shock surged through the student body. In the dormitories, training fields, and lecture halls, cadets exchanged startled glances. A Terran professor? This was unheard of. Chancellor Zellara continued, unperturbed by the sudden wave of curiosity and excitement. His name is Captain Leo Drake, a former officer in the Terran Defense Force and a war hero of their infamous Epsilon skirmish. Captain Drake will be teaching a course on advanced strategic warfare and adaptive combat tactics. Registration for his class is now open, but given the high demand, not all who apply will be selected. The announcement ended, and the Academy's crest faded from the screens. The halls, which had been buzzing with idle conversation moments earlier, now hummed with a new intensity. Students crowded together, already chattering about the arrival of this mysterious figure from a race few of them had ever taken seriously before. Arima, the silver-skinned Elvorian who had challenged Professor Grok in the previous class, stood in a group of his peers, his violet eyes narrowed thoughtfully. His earlier dismissal of the Terrans now seemed embarrassingly short-sighted. He looked around at his fellow students, many of whom were already speculating about the upcoming semester. A slender Lagwan cadet, Ares, nudged Arima, his blue-scaled skin shimmering in the Academy's soft light. "What do you think, Arima?" Ares asked, his tone still carrying the edge of doubt. "Do you think Grok's story was true? About the Zegars being outwitted by the Terrans?" Arima folded his arms across his chest. "I don't know anymore. The Zegars aren't fools, and yet Grok isn't the kind of man to embellish. If this Terran professor has half the ingenuity Grok claims they possess, I think we'd be wise not to underestimate him." Around them, the excitement only grew. Every race, every faction within the Academy had heard the same stories about Terrans, and now they were on edge, eager to see what this new professor would bring. Ithra, a towering Krokan cadet with skin like hammered stone, grunted in disbelief. "What could a Terran possibly teach us about war?" Ithra rumbled, his deep voice cutting through the chatter. "We Krokans have been fighting since we first crawled out of the seas on our homeworld. No one knows battle like we do." Arima shook his head. "That may be true, Ithra, but we've all heard the stories now. If half of them are to be believed, this Captain Drake might be able to teach us something we've never considered. You saw Grok's face during the lecture, he wasn't joking. And we all know Grok doesn't respect them easily." Not far away, a group of Zegar cadets were huddled together, whispering fiercely. Their silver and bronze armor glinted in the artificial sunlight, their multi-limbed bodies moving with insectoid grace. The Zegar, known for their cold precision, rarely displayed open emotion, but now even they seemed disturbed. "This is some kind of joke," one of them, Jaya, hissed. "A Terran teaching us about strategy? After what they did to our people centuries ago. It's an insult." One of the other Zegar, her mandibles clicking nervously, responded, "But think about it, Jaya. If they did defeat us, if they really did infiltrate our capital with only a handful of ships, shouldn't we be the first ones in line to learn how they did it?" Jaya clicked his mandibles in frustration but said nothing. The truth was, the Zegar Empire had never fully recovered from the humiliation of their defeat. If the rumors were true, if this Captain Drake could shed any light on how the Terrans had done it, then perhaps they could reclaim some of that lost honor. Meanwhile, back in the central plaza of the Academy, the enthusiasm for Captain Drake's class continued to grow. Kirel, a cadet from the plant-like Ethel race, her leafy tendrils twitching with excitement, joined the conversation. "I just signed up for the class," she said, her voice high-pitched with enthusiasm. "Did you know the Epsilon skirmish he fought in lasted only 2 days? And the Terrans were outnumbered 5-1. Somehow, they outmaneuvered their opponents and turned the tide." Ares frowned. Isn't that just Terran propaganda? Their news networks embellish things. Kirel shook her head, her bright green eyes flashing. Not this time. The official Alliance report confirms it. The Terrans have their flaws, but there's something different about how they fight. It's almost like they don't see limitations the same way we do. I need to know how they think. Around them, cadets from every race clamored to join Captain Drake's class. The Academy's registration servers were flooded with applications within minutes. Despite the Terrans' relative obscurity in the galaxy, the chance to study under one, especially a former captain from the fabled Epsilon skirmish, was too rare an opportunity to miss. As the cadets dispersed, returning to their studies or their training, one thought echoed through all their minds: this was no ordinary class, and Captain Drake was no ordinary professor. Whatever the Terrans' reputation might have been, it was clear that their arrival at the Academy was going to change everything. Later that day, in a secluded corner of the Academy's sprawling library, Arima found himself in quiet contemplation. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the towering windows. As he read through archived battle reports on the Epsilon skirmish, a part of him still struggled to accept that a Terran could be as formidable as Grok had implied. Just then, Ari slid into the seat across from him, a datapad in hand. "I got in," he said, grinning. Arima raised an eyebrow. "Into Drake's class?" Ares nodded. "Barely. The list filled up within minutes." "You?" Arima glanced at his own datapad, which displayed a flashing confirmation. "I'm in." The two cadets exchanged a glance, excitement, tension, and a tinge of fear. The anticipation had been building for weeks, and now the day had arrived. The lecture hall was unlike any other at the Interstellar Academy. Large enough to hold hundreds of students, it was designed to resemble the command deck of a starship. Holoscreens lined the walls, displaying tactical maps, star charts, and real-time feeds from military outposts across the galaxy. Rows of tiered seats encircled the center of the room, where the instructor's podium stood. Every seat was filled. The students, cadets from over a dozen races, sat in tense silence, eyes fixed on the empty podium. Some whispered excitedly about the stories they had heard. Others, especially the Krokans and Zegars, were still skeptical. But curiosity had overruled doubt, and no one had wanted to miss Captain Leo Drake's first class. Suddenly, the lights dimmed, and the sound of the main doors sliding open echoed through the chamber. A figure stepped into the room. He was unassuming at first glance, human, average height, dressed not in the traditional robes of an academy professor but in a well-worn military uniform. His face bore the lines of age and experience, his dark eyes sharp and calculating. There was no grand entrance, no elaborate speech. Captain Drake simply walked to the podium, placed a small device on it, and stood in silence for a moment, letting his presence settle over the room. "Welcome to Advanced Strategic Warfare and Adaptive Combat Tactics class," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made everyone sit up a little straighter. "I am Captain Leo Drake, and by the end of this course, you will have learned one simple lesson: the galaxy doesn't care about your strength, your technology, or your traditions. It cares about who survives." His words hung in the air like a challenge, the kind that every cadet in the room felt compelled to meet. Drake glanced around the room, his eyes sweeping over the faces of his students, from the hulking, stone-skinned Krokans to the sleek, amphibious Largua and the insectoid Zegars. Each species, with its own unique strengths, had dominated battles in its own way. But Drake wasn't interested in their advantages. "Now, let's begin," he said, pressing a button on the podium. The room darkened, and a holographic display sprang to life above them. It showed a simulation of a battlefield, two fleets of ships in deep space, one far superior in size and firepower, the other much smaller and seemingly outmatched. The insignia of the mighty Zegar Empire flashed on the larger fleet, while the smaller one bore the unmistakable mark of the Terran Defense Force. "You're looking at a recreation of the Epsilon skirmish," Drake explained. "The Zegars had us outnumbered 5-1. They had better ships, more advanced technology, and every advantage you could think of. By all calculations, the Terrans should have been annihilated in the first hour. And yet, we won. A ripple of disbelief swept through the room. The Zigars in the class shifted uncomfortably, their mandibles clicking in frustration. One of them, Jaya, a proud Zigar cadet from a noble family, couldn't stay silent any longer. "That's impossible," Jaya said, his voice filled with indignation. "Our fleet's defensive systems are the best in the galaxy. No one could penetrate them, especially not a ragtag Terran force." Drake turned to face him, unruffled by the challenge. "You're correct, Jaya. Your defense systems were nearly flawless. The problem was, you were too focused on them." He waved his hand, and the simulation zoomed in on a particular sector of the battlefield. The Zigar fleet had formed an impenetrable defensive perimeter, each ship positioned perfectly to cover the others, their powerful cannons poised to obliterate any enemy that approached. "You see this formation?" Drake asked, pointing to the Zigar fleet. "It's brilliant. A textbook defense strategy. But it's also predictable." He adjusted the display, and the scene shifted. The Terran ships, much smaller and faster, were darting around the edges of the Zigar fleet, never engaging directly. The Zigar forces fired at them repeatedly, but the Terran ships always managed to stay just out of range. "We didn't fight your fleet head-on," Drake continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "That would have been suicide. Instead, we used our smaller ships to draw your fire and distract your heavy cruisers. While you were busy trying to lock onto our decoys, we slipped behind your lines with a strike force so small you didn't even notice." He zoomed in further, showing a group of Terran vessels sneaking through a blind spot in the Zigar defenses, using the debris from the battle as cover. "By the time you realized what was happening," Drake said, "we were already inside your command ship's defensive perimeter. We disabled your central command and captured your officers, forcing your entire fleet into disarray. The battle was over before most of your ships could even react." The room was silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. Even the Zigar cadets, who had initially bristled at the idea of a Terran victory, now watched the simulation with a mix of disbelief and begrudging respect. Drake paused the simulation and turned to face the class again. "The lesson here is simple. Superior firepower and technology mean nothing if you can't adapt. If you rely too much on what you think makes you strong, you leave yourself open to those who are willing to think differently." He let the silence stretch for a moment before continuing. "This course isn't about teaching you to be the strongest. It's about teaching you to be the smartest. To see the battlefield in ways others can't. To use the enemy's strengths against them. If you can learn that, you won't just survive, you'll win." From the back of the room, Arima, the Elvorian cadet who had once doubted Terran ingenuity, raised his hand. "Captain," he began, his voice more respectful now, "what you did in the Epsilon skirmish was brilliant, but it seems like it relied on a lot of luck. What if the Zigars had detected your strike force earlier? What if they had a backup command ship? Wouldn't the plan have failed?" Drake nodded, as if he had expected the question. "Good observation, Arima. Every plan involves risk. That's inevitable. The key is to minimize those risks by thinking several moves ahead. In the Epsilon skirmish, we accounted for the possibility of failure. That's why we had 2 contingency plans. If we couldn't disable the command ship, we had a backup strike team ready to target their communications array, cutting off their ability to coordinate. And if that failed, we had a 3rd team prepared to engage the Zigar flagship directly." He walked around the podium, moving closer to the students, his eyes sharp and intense. "In war, there are no guarantees. But the more adaptable you are, the more flexible your strategy, the more you can shape the battlefield to your advantage. That's what I'll teach you in this class. Not how to rely on brute strength or overwhelming force, but how to think, how to outmaneuver, outwit, and outlast your enemy." The room was completely still now. Every cadet, from the smallest Frynan to the towering Kroken, was hanging on Drake's every word. He turned and activated the hologram again, but this time it displayed a map of the entire galaxy, marked with dozens of ongoing conflicts, skirmishes, and political tensions. "The galaxy is changing," Drake said, his voice low but powerful. Old alliances are breaking. New threats are rising. The battles of tomorrow won't be fought with the same rules we're used to. If you want to be the leaders of the future, you need to think like the future. And if you want to survive, you need to learn how to adapt. With that, he deactivated the hologram and stepped back to the podium. Class dismissed. The students sat in stunned silence for a few moments, absorbing everything they had just learned. Slowly, they began to gather their things, filing out of the room in quiet contemplation. Arima lingered near the door, deep in thought. As he turned to leave, Drake's voice called out to him. "Arima," Drake said, his tone unreadable. "I'll see you tomorrow." Arima nodded, feeling a strange mix of respect and anticipation. He had come to the class expecting to prove a point, perhaps to show that the Terrans were overrated, their reputation exaggerated. But now, after seeing Drake in action, he knew that whatever the future held, it was no longer just about strength or tradition. It was about something far more dangerous. It was about the mind and the ability to adapt. The rise of Captain Drake. The transformation at the Interstellar Academy was swift, yet unmistakable. Only a few short months had passed since Captain Leo Drake, the unassuming Terran war hero, had taken up his post as a professor. In that time, whispers about his classes had turned into thunderous discussions. Cadets from every corner of the galaxy now spoke his name with reverence, his lessons becoming the talk of every dormitory, mess hall, and training yard. A Terran, once dismissed by many as fragile and insignificant in the grand scope of the galaxy, had become the Academy's most sought-after instructor. What had started as a quiet curiosity was now a fevered demand. Every cadet wanted to be in Drake's class. It was an early morning, just as the twin suns of Kyria crested the horizon, casting golden rays across the gleaming towers of the Academy. The air hummed with excitement. The Academy's corridors, usually tranquil at this hour, were bustling with students, some already in line at the registration center, others discussing the latest developments around Captain Drake's classes. In a dimly lit hall on the Academy's eastern wing, Professor Grok, the seasoned war veteran and Drake's former mentor, stood by a wide window, watching the sunrise. His scarred hands rested behind his back, his eyes narrow with thought. The ripple effect of Drake's teaching methods had grown far beyond what even he had anticipated. He wasn't alone for long. Chancellor Zelara, her cobalt blue skin shimmering in the early light, approached him. Her 6 glowing eyes were serene, though tinged with the same thoughtfulness that Grok felt. "You were right about him," she said quietly, her voice carrying the melodic undertones that could soothe even the most hardened of warriors. Grok nodded slowly, still staring out over the Academy grounds. "I've been in enough battles to recognize true leadership when I see it. But even I didn't expect him to cause such a shift so quickly." Zelara's gaze followed his, landing on the growing crowd of students gathered outside the central building, all vying for spots in Drake's upcoming term. A shift? Grok, he's done more than that. He's changed how this generation views warfare, leadership, perhaps even the future of the galaxy itself. Grok finally turned to face her, his expression softened by a hint of pride. "You know, I taught him. Back when he was just a young officer, fresh out of Earth's Defense Force Academy. Back then, no one thought much of Terrans. But he was different. Even then, he had the same sharpness of mind, the same understanding that the strongest weapon is the ability to adapt. Still," Zelara mused, "we've had famous professors before. What makes him so special?" Grok smiled. "Because he doesn't just teach tactics or strategies. He teaches them to think, to question everything they believe about power, strength, and survival. In a galaxy like ours, where tradition dominates every aspect of society, that's a revolution in itself." Meanwhile, across the Academy, the students were already gathering for the day's first session of Drake's class. The room, designed to accommodate 100 cadets, had been expanded twice since the beginning of the semester, and yet it still couldn't hold all those who clamored to attend. The Academy administration had installed holo feeds in adjacent rooms to stream his lectures, though everyone knew there was nothing quite like experiencing Drake in person. Arima, the Elvorian cadet who had once questioned Terran capabilities, now stood near the front of the room, early as always. He had come to respect Drake deeply, his initial skepticism long since shattered. Around him, cadets of every race crowded in, their chatter buzzing with excitement. Even the usually standoffish Seagars, including Jaya, had become regulars in the class, no longer able to deny Drake's strategic genius. Just as the room filled to capacity, the lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd. Captain Drake entered, his presence as unassuming as ever, dressed in his standard-issue Terran uniform. He approached the podium without fanfare, his expression calm, though his eyes gleamed with the intensity that had become his trademark. "Good morning, cadets," he began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Today, we're going to talk about the concept of asymmetrical warfare, how a smaller, seemingly weaker force can dismantle a much larger, more powerful opponent." He activated the holo display behind him, showing the details of a recent skirmish between two minor galactic factions, an engagement that few of the students had heard about. Drake never relied on the famous battles that the galaxy's history books already revered. He preferred to teach from conflicts that most had overlooked, the ones where brilliance wasn't found in strength, but in subtlety. "Look at the positioning of this fleet," Drake said, zooming in on the map of the battle. "Notice how the smaller force uses the environment, asteroid fields, space debris, solar flares, not just to hide, but to manipulate the larger fleet's movements." The students leaned forward, engrossed as Drake broke down the battle, frame by frame. He didn't just explain tactics, he led the students through the thought process behind them. Every cadet, from the lowliest to the most promising, could feel themselves becoming part of the battle, as though they were commanders making the decisions in real time. Halfway through the class, a bold Krokan cadet named Ithra raised his massive hand. Drake paused, nodding for him to speak. "Captain," Ithra rumbled, his deep voice resonating throughout the room, "these tactics are impressive, but in the end, isn't it the side with the most firepower that always wins? This smaller fleet, they survived, sure, but they didn't win the war." Drake's expression didn't change, though his eyes sharpened as they met Ithra's. "That's a common belief," Drake replied, his voice measured. "But tell me, Ithra, how do you define a winning?" The question hung in the air, unexpected. The Krokan hesitated, clearly unsure of how to answer. "Most cadets in this room," Drake continued, "have been taught that victory is domination. That to win a war, you must crush your enemy, overpower them completely. But that's not always the case. Sometimes, victory is survival. Sometimes, it's outlasting your enemy, bleeding them slowly until they can't continue. It's about denying them their objectives. That's how smaller, weaker forces can defeat far greater opponents, not by matching them in strength, but by changing the rules of the game." He paused, looking around the room, making sure his words had settled. "And that's exactly what we, as Terrans, have always done. We don't fight wars like the Krokans, or the Seagars, or even the Elvorians. We fight to outthink, to adapt, and to turn every disadvantage into an advantage. Sometimes, that means surviving long enough for the enemy to collapse under its own weight." The students were silent, captivated by the sheer depth of his perspective. Drake didn't just challenge their understanding of warfare, he challenged their understanding of power itself. For many of them, it was a revelation. As the class continued, Drake led them through more scenarios, pushing them to think critically, to question everything they had ever known about combat and strategy. By the time the lecture ended, the cadets were left with more questions than answers, but that was Drake's way. He wasn't interested in giving them easy truths, he wanted them to seek their own. Over the weeks, Captain Drake's fame within the academy only grew. Students from other departments began attending his lectures, and some of the academy's most seasoned professors even dropped in to observe his unorthodox methods. What started as curiosity had turned into a phenomenon. Cadets across the academy, from first years to seniors, spoke of Drake's classes in tones usually reserved for galactic legends. Ares, the brilliant but pragmatic Lagwan cadet, summed up the growing sentiment among his peers as they sat in the mess hall one afternoon. "Drake's different," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "He's not just teaching us to win battles. He's teaching us to redefine them." Arima nodded. "He doesn't care about traditions or conventions. He looks at war, and the galaxy, as a puzzle to be solved. It's no wonder everyone wants to study under him. Even Ithra, the gruff Krokan who had initially doubted Drake's methods, had changed his tune. "He's made me question everything I thought I knew about combat," he admitted. "And if I'm learning something, that means the rest of you definitely are." By the end of the semester, Captain Leo Drake had become more than just a famous teacher, he had become a symbol. A symbol of change, of adaptability, and of the idea that no matter where you came from, no matter how strong or weak you were, the ability to think could make all the difference. As cadets registered for the following term, one thing became clear: Drake's classes would fill up even faster. 15 years had passed since Captain Leo Drake had first stepped into the halls of the Interstellar Academy, a quiet Terran whose name would soon echo across the galaxy. In those years, his teachings had fundamentally changed how the galaxy thought about warfare, and his influence had extended far beyond the Academy's walls. What had begun as simple lectures on strategy had grown into something far deeper: mentorship. For 3 years after their first encounter with Drake, Arima, Ithra, and Ares, cadets of different races and cultures, became his personal disciples. They studied under him privately, learning everything he could teach them, not only about warfare but about leadership, adaptability, and survival. What Drake imparted wasn't just knowledge, it was a new way of seeing the galaxy. And it would prepare them for the greatest challenge of their lives: the Roxin invasion. The galaxy had enjoyed relative peace for years under the watchful eyes of the Intergalactic Alliance, a coalition of the galaxy's most powerful races. But peace, as Drake had often reminded his students, was only an illusion, one that could be shattered at any moment. And it was. The Roxin, a race of conquerors from beyond the known galaxy, came like a storm. They swept through the uncharted fringes of the galaxy with brutal efficiency, their technology far surpassing anything the Alliance had ever encountered. Entire systems fell before the Alliance could even mobilize a defense, and their seemingly invincible fleets advanced toward the core worlds at a terrifying speed. In this time of crisis, the galaxy turned to its greatest minds. Among them were Admiral Arima, Admiral Ithra, and Admiral Ares, now leaders of the Intergalactic Alliance's most elite fleets. Alongside them, the once skeptical Ziga cadet, Admiral Jaya, had also risen through the ranks, his respect for Terran tactics now unshakable. And at the heart of their collective strategy? Everything they had learned from Captain Drake. The atmosphere inside the galactic war room was tense. Admirals from dozens of races sat around the vast circular table, their holographic displays showing the relentless advance of the Roxin armada. Planets and systems flickered on the screens, each representing a world that had either fallen or was on the brink of collapse. Admiral Arima, his silver Elvorian skin glowing faintly under the war room's dim lights, studied the maps intently. His sharp violet eyes darted across the strategic readouts, calculating possibilities. Next to him, Admiral Ithra, now a towering figure of Krokan might, sat with his arms crossed, the gleam of battle hunger in his stone-like gaze. "We've tried direct engagement," Ithra growled. "It doesn't work. Their shields are impenetrable. We lose too many ships before we can even breach their first line of defense." Admiral Ares, ever the tactician, tapped at his console, bringing up a new set of projections. The Laguan shimmering blue scales reflected the light as he spoke. "We've studied their fleet patterns. They rely heavily on centralized control from their command ships. If we can disrupt their chain of command, we might create enough confusion to give us an opening." Admiral Jaya, the once proud Ziga who had learned the value of humility and adaptability from Drake, nodded in agreement. "We'll need to strike fast and hard, using diversionary tactics. But we can't risk the core systems in a frontal assault." The war room fell silent as a figure stepped into the light. Though older now, Captain Drake, no longer a captain, but a revered strategist, had lost none of the calm authority that had once commanded the respect of students and admirals alike. His eyes, still sharp, took in the room with a single glance, and the quiet murmurs ceased immediately. Even the most senior commanders held their breath when Drake entered the room. "We can't fight this war by their rules," Drake said, his voice even but commanding. "The Roxin are stronger, faster, and their technology is beyond ours. But they're vulnerable in ways they can't see. Like many powerful empires, they rely on their superiority and assume we'll play into their hands. He activated the main holographic display, and the galaxy appeared before them. Drake zoomed in on Roxin's forward fleet, which was nearing a key system in the Alliance's territory. We don't engage them head-on. We fight them the way they don't expect, by turning their strength against them. The admirals leaned forward, eager to hear their mentor's plan. Arima, Ithra, Ares, and Jaya, the core of the new generation of leaders, listened intently. This was the moment they had been preparing for, ever since their days as cadets in the academy. The first major battle took place at Delta Crucis, a star system on the edge of Alliance territory. The Roxin fleet, numbering in the thousands, approached with brutal precision, their massive ships dwarfing the smaller Alliance vessels. The plan, as outlined by Drake and his disciples, was risky. But it was the kind of risk they had all learned to embrace. Admiral Arima led the fleet from the command ship Starlight Fury, his voice steady as he gave the final orders. Remember what Drake taught us. Don't fight their strength. Exploit their weaknesses. Admiral Ares, commanding a separate strike force, prepared his ships to move into position, his Laguan mind calculating every possible outcome. Meanwhile, Ithra's heavy assault fleet waited in the wings, ready to act as the hammer when the time came. As the Roxin fleet advanced, it became clear that their superior numbers and technology were, as Drake had predicted, both their greatest strength and their most dangerous weakness. The Roxin moved as one massive unit, their command centralized and inflexible. It was their Achilles heel. Arima's fleet darted in and out of Roxin formations, refusing to engage in prolonged battles. Their ships moved like phantoms, distracting the Roxin long enough for Ares's strike force to slip through the cracks in their formation. Then came the decisive moment. As the Roxin focused their firepower on Arima's ships, they left a narrow corridor open, a corridor that Jaya, with his Zygar strike team, had been waiting for. They charged through, undetected until it was too late. Their target wasn't the Roxin ships, it was their command center, deep within the fleet. In a precise strike, Jaya's team disabled the Roxin central command node. Suddenly, the entire Roxin fleet staggered, their ships disoriented, unable to coordinate. It was the opening the Alliance needed. Now! Ithra roared, his croaking voice shaking the decks of his warship. His heavy assault fleet, hidden in the gravitational pull of a nearby gas giant, surged forward, smashing into the Roxin ships with overwhelming force. Without their centralized command, the Roxin ships were unable to mount an effective defense. The battle was over in hours. The seemingly unstoppable Roxin fleet had been crippled, forced to retreat into uncharted space. The Alliance had won its first major victory in the war. The victory at Delta Crucis was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, Arima, Ithra, Ares, and Jaya led the Alliance forces in a series of brilliant campaigns, each time using the lessons they had learned from Drake to outmaneuver and outthink the Roxin. They turned the tide of the war, and by the end of it, they had become legends in their own right. But none of them ever forgot who had made it all possible. When the Roxin invasion finally ended, with the signing of the Treaty of Ornos, the galaxy looked to its new heroes. Admiral Arima, with his unmatched intellect and tactical genius. Admiral Ithra, whose brute force had broken the back of the Roxin fleet. Admiral Ares, the master strategist who always stayed 2 steps ahead of the enemy. And Admiral Jaya, who had proven that even the proud Zygars could learn humility and adaptability. But above all, they remembered Leo Drake, the Terran who had taught them how to survive and thrive in a galaxy that had once dismissed his people as weak. Drake, now retired from the battlefield, was hailed as one of the greatest military minds in the history of the galaxy. Statues were erected in his honor in Kyria, the capital of the Intergalactic Alliance. His name was etched into the annals of history alongside the greatest commanders from every race. No longer were the Terrans seen as fragile or inferior. They were admired for their ingenuity, their adaptability, and their relentless determination to survive against all odds. And it was all because of one man, a teacher, a strategist, and the mentor who had shaped the galaxy's future. Leo Drake's legacy would live on for millennia, not just in the history books, but in the minds of every cadet who passed through the Academy's doors. He had proven, once and for all, that the greatest strength was not found in power or numbers, but in the ability to think, to adapt, and to rise above every challenge. And as long as the galaxy endured, so too would the legend of Captain Leo Drake and his disciples.
If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel and press the like button. It helps me a lot. Thank you very much.